I know you are not a Navy
uniform
officer.
isn't yours.
You were given it, or maybe you stole it from someone.
Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. This is mine. I'm a Navy SEAL officer,
John,
right?
I earned every
What's
stitch
yours?
and stay away.
May 28th, 2024. Veterans Memorial Park, Charleston, South Carolina. Marcus Washington had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless classified operations across 4 continents. A middle-aged white woman with a cell phone would be his downfall. Rebecca Manning pointed her manicured finger at his chest full of ribbons. "You're not a real soldier," she said loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I'm calling the police on you for stolen valor." 300 people watched as she dialed 911. Marcus stood perfectly still in his dress blues, knowing that any movement would be seen as aggression. The phone cameras started rolling. What happened next would expose a military cover-up spanning 2 decades. It would destroy 2 families and reveal that sometimes the enemy you never saw coming is the one who's been planning their attack for 20 years. The day Rebecca Manning declared war on Tank Washington. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first sirens were already wailing in the distance. Marcus kept his hands visible, clasped behind his back in parade rest, a position so ingrained after 30 years that his body moved into it without conscious thought. The Memorial Day crowd pressed closer, phones held high like weapons, recording every second of what would soon become the most watched public humiliation in Charleston's recent memory. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect from Delta Force operators, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Rebecca Manning's perfectly styled blonde hair caught the afternoon sun as she shook her head with theatrical disgust. Her designer sundress and pearls screamed country club privilege, the kind of woman who'd never known real fear, never watched friends die, never carried the weight of decisions that saved some lives by sacrificing others. "Don't you dare ma'am me," she snapped, her voice rising to performance volume. "You think you can just dress up and play soldier? Those medals are fake. That uniform is costume. I know stolen valor when I see it." The crowd murmured. Marcus caught fragments of whispered conversations, the uncertainty in their voices. Some knew him. He'd lived in Charleston for 3 years, ran the Warriors Haven Outreach Center downtown. But doubt was a virus, and Rebecca Manning was patient zero. Marcus's jaw tightened. The Navy cross on his chest felt suddenly heavy, remembering the weight of the decisions that had earned it. Operation Sandstorm, 17 years ago, outside Fallujah. 3 American hostages rescued. A war correspondent's investigation buried forever. Some medals came with a price that kept bleeding long after the ceremony ended. "I served this country for 30 years, Marcus said, loud enough for the crowd to hear but still controlled. "I earned every ribbon, every medal, every scar." Rebecca's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Served where? When? Prove it." She gestured to the crowd with one hand while keeping her phone pressed to her ear with the other. "Yes, officer, I'm at Veterans Memorial Park. There's a man here impersonating a military officer, and I want him arrested." The first police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, blue lights painting the memorial in harsh, strobing color. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, not from fear, but from the muscle memory of combat. Flashing lights meant incoming helicopters. Sirens meant wounded friendlies. His training wanted him to move, to take cover, to prepare for contact. Instead, he remained perfectly still. Officer Sarah Chen approached first, her hand resting on her radio but not her weapon, a good sign. Marcus had met her twice at community events. She knew his face, knew his reputation. Behind her came her partner, a young guy Marcus didn't recognize, his hand hovering near his holster. "What's the situation here?" Chen asked, her eyes moving between Marcus and Rebecca. "This man is committing stolen valor," Rebecca announced before Marcus could speak. "He's wearing a military uniform he didn't earn, displaying medals that aren't his. It's a federal crime, and I want him arrested immediately." Chen looked at Marcus, confusion flickering across her face. "Colonel Washington? You want to explain what's happening here?" The crowd pressed closer at the title. Colonel. That carried weight, especially in a military town like Charleston. But Rebecca wasn't backing down. "Colonel?" She laughed again. "You're all being fooled. Look at him. Does he look like officer material to you?" The racist implication hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Marcus had faced this before. Countless times over 3 decades in predominantly white military leadership, but never so publicly. Never with this many witnesses, never while wearing the dress blues that represented every sacrifice he'd made for a country that still questioned his right to serve. "Ma'am," Officer Chen said to Rebecca, her tone cooling noticeably, "do you have any evidence that this gentleman's uniform or service record is fraudulent?" "He's black," Rebecca said, as if that explained everything. "And he's here alone. Real officers have friends, have units, have people who know them. Look around. Does anyone here actually know this man?" "I do." The voice came from the crowd. Then another. "I know Tank Washington." More voices joined in. "He runs the Veteran Center downtown. He helped my son get into college. He's been to my church." Rebecca's composure cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "Anyone can fool a few people. I'm telling you, something's not right here. My father was a military journalist. I know what real soldiers look like." The mention of her father sent ice through Marcus's veins. Military journalist. The pieces began clicking into place with the mechanical precision of a rifle being assembled in darkness. The way she'd approached him specifically, the calculated timing, the deliberate provocation. This wasn't random. This was an ambush 20 years in the making. Marcus looked directly at Rebecca Manning for the first time, really looked at her, searching for familiar features in her face. When he found them, his blood turned to Arctic water. She smiled back at him, and in that smile was the promise of absolute destruction. The recognition hit Marcus like shrapnel, sudden, deep, and spreading through his system with the slow burn of internal bleeding. Rebecca Manning's eyes held the same pale blue intensity he remembered from grainy surveillance photos, the same defiant tilt of the chin that had gotten her father killed in a bombed-out building in Fallujah 17 years ago. David Manning, war correspondent. The man who'd been asking the wrong questions about Operation Sandstorm, digging into classified after-action reports, following leads that would have exposed the civilian casualties Marcus's team had been ordered to bury. The man whose death had been filed as collateral damage when insurgents hit the compound where he'd been staying, the same compound Marcus had visited 12 hours earlier to confiscate Manning's notes and recordings. Marcus forced his breathing to remain steady, but his chest felt tight beneath the weight of his service ribbons. Each medal suddenly felt like evidence in a trial he'd thought would never come. The Navy Cross pressed against his sternum, awarded for extraordinary heroism in the same operation that had silenced David Manning forever. "Sir?" Officer Chen's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Are you all right?" Marcus blinked, refocusing on the present. The crowd still pressed around them, phone still recording, but Rebecca's smile had shifted into something patient and predatory. She was enjoying this, not just the public humiliation, but watching him piece together exactly how trapped he was. "I'm fine, Officer Chen," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening beneath his feet. "Just remembering something." "Remembering what?" Rebecca asked sweetly. "Having trouble keeping your stolen story straight?" The accusation should have stung, but Marcus was too busy calculating threats and exits. If Rebecca knew who he was, really knew, then she had access to information that could destroy more than just his reputation. Operation Sandstorm remained classified. The civilian casualties were still buried under national security classifications. But if David Manning had been her father, if she'd inherited his research, Marcus thought of Warriors Haven, the small veteran center that had become his life's work after retirement. 12 full-time residents, all struggling with PTSD, addiction, or homelessness. Men and women who depended on the funding he'd fought for, the programs he'd built from nothing. They'd lose everything if this went public the wrong way. He thought of Keisha, his daughter, who'd only recently started returning his calls after 8 years of silence. She was finishing her residency at Johns Hopkins, building the medical career his absence during her childhood had motivated her toward. A viral video of her father being accused of stolen valor would follow her forever in a profession where reputation meant everything. He thought of the other operators from Sandstorm, the ones still active, still serving, still carrying classified secrets that could get people killed if exposed. They trusted him to keep their missions buried. That trust was sacred, even when the weight of it felt like drowning. Colonel Washington, Officer Chen said, "We're going to need to sort this out properly. Would you be willing to come to the station to provide documentation of your service record?" Before Marcus could answer, Rebecca stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear her whisper, "He won't be able to provide everything you need, officer. Some of his most important work was never supposed to see daylight. Isn't that right, Tank? The use of his call sign, a nickname only his military family had used, confirmed what Marcus already knew. This wasn't about stolen valor. This wasn't about racial profiling or public humiliation, though Rebecca was happy to weaponize both. This was about a daughter who'd spent 17 years investigating her father's death and had finally found the man responsible for silencing him. Marcus looked past Rebecca to the memorial wall behind them, at the hundreds of names carved into black granite. Good soldiers who died for complicated reasons in ugly wars. David Manning's name wasn't on any memorial, because war correspondents didn't get monuments, but his daughter was building him one anyway, using Marcus's reputation as the foundation stone. The crowd was getting restless. More police cars had arrived. Someone had called a news crew. Marcus could see the Channel 7 van pulling into the parking lot. In 10 minutes, this would be live television. In an hour, it would be social media wildfire. By tomorrow, it would be national news. Decorated black officer accused of stolen valor at Memorial Day ceremony. Rebecca Manning had chosen her battlefield perfectly. Public enough to be humiliating, symbolic enough to be damaging, recorded enough to be permanent, and legally complex enough to force discovery of documents that were never supposed to see daylight. Marcus straightened his shoulders and prepared for the longest war of his life. Rebecca wanted to destroy him for what happened to her father? Fine. But she'd learned the same lesson David Manning had. When you dig up classified graves, sometimes the dead reach up and pull you down with them. The news van's door slammed shut. Cameras were coming online. The real battle was about to begin. The Channel 7 camera crew was setting up when Marcus felt his phone vibrate against his chest. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, the emergency pattern he'd programmed years ago for calls that couldn't wait. He glanced at the screen through his dress uniform pocket. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Pentagon, Classified Affairs Division. Marcus hadn't heard from Cad in 3 years, not since his final security debriefing. Not since they'd made it crystal clear that his retirement came with permanent silence agreements that would follow him to his grave. They only called when classified operations were compromised, which meant Rebecca Manning had already made her first move. "Excuse me," Marcus said to Officer Chen, stepping away from the crowd. "I need to take this." "Colonel, we really need to—" "1 minute." Marcus's tone carried enough command authority to stop Chen mid-sentence. Some habits from 30 years of leadership died hard. He answered on the 4th ring. "Washington." "Tank." The voice belonged to Colonel Patricia Hayes, his former handler at Special Operations Command. She sounded like she'd aged a decade since their last conversation. "We have a problem." "I'm aware." Marcus watched Rebecca Manning pose for the news cameras, playing the concerned citizen to perfection. "How long have you known?" 47 minutes. Someone with impressive credentials just submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for Operation Sandstorm files. Complete records, after-action reports, casualty assessments, everything. The phone felt heavy in Marcus's hand. FOIA requests for classified material were usually denied automatically, but the process created a paper trail. Questions got asked, investigations got opened, and Rebecca Manning clearly knew exactly which documents to request. Who submitted it? Law firm called Brennan, Cross & Associates, high-end litigation specialists out of Atlanta. They're representing a Rebecca Manning in preparation for a potential federal lawsuit. Marcus closed his eyes. She wasn't just seeking revenge. She was building a legal case that would force the government to choose between protecting classified information and defending him in court. Either way, the truth about Sandstorm would surface. "Tank, what the hell did you do down there?" The question hung in the humid Charleston air like cordite after an explosion. What had he done? He'd followed orders. He'd saved 3 American hostages. He'd prevented a war correspondent from publishing a story that would have revealed intelligence sources and gotten assets killed. He'd made the impossible choice that special operators were trained to make, save lives by sacrificing others. But David Manning's daughter wouldn't see it that way. To her, Marcus was the man who'd stolen her father's last story and left him to die in a building that got bombed 12 hours after Marcus confiscated his research. "I did my job," Marcus said finally. "Well, your job from 17 years ago is about to become our job today. SecDef wants a full damage assessment by 0800 tomorrow. Every operator from Sandstorm is being recalled for emergency debriefing. And Tank?" Hayes' voice dropped. "They're talking about throwing you to the wolves." The words hit like a sniper's bullet. Precise, devastating, and from a direction he should have seen coming. After 30 years of loyal service, the Pentagon was prepared to sacrifice him to protect operational security. They'd let Rebecca Manning destroy him publicly, rather than risk exposing active intelligence networks. "Copy that," Marcus said, watching the news reporter adjust his tie and check his notes. In 30 seconds, they'd go live. In 30 minutes, his face would be on every screen in South Carolina. In 30 hours, his life would be over. There's something else. Hayes sounded like she was reading from a script. Manning's attorney also submitted personnel requests for your psychological evaluations, pre-deployment screenings, post-mission debriefs. They're building a profile. Marcus felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. Rebecca wasn't just seeking justice for her father. She was trying to prove that Marcus was psychologically unfit for command during Operation Sandstorm. If she could establish mental instability, she could argue that the civilian casualties weren't just collateral damage, but the result of a compromised operator making deadly decisions. How much does she know? More than she should. Less than she thinks. Hayes paused. "Tank, there are things about Sandstorm that even you weren't briefed on. Things that could change how this whole situation looks." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the news reporter signaled his cameraman. The red light came on. Rebecca Manning straightened her shoulders and prepared to tell her version of the story to the world. Marcus ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Around him, the Memorial Day crowd had swollen with curious onlookers drawn by the police cars and news crew. Officer Chen was explaining the situation to her supervisor. Rebecca Manning was positioning herself in the perfect camera angle, with Marcus visible over her shoulder like a criminal in a perp walk. 30 years of classified service, 3 years of peaceful retirement, one phone call that changed everything. The past had finally caught up with Colonel Marcus Tank Washington, and it was wearing the face of a dead man's daughter. The red light on the news camera blinked like a sniper's laser sight, and Marcus felt 17 years of careful distance collapse in an instant. He pocketed his phone and tried to blend into the crowd, but his dress blues made him a beacon. Every ribbon, every medal, every perfectly pressed crease screamed for attention he no longer wanted. "This is Amanda Rodriguez reporting live from Veterans Memorial Park," the reporter began, her voice carrying across the crowd with practiced clarity, "where a Memorial Day ceremony has taken an unexpected turn." Marcus began walking toward the parking lot, each step measured and deliberate. "Don't run. Don't give them the footage of a guilty man fleeing." But the crowd seemed to follow his movement, phones tracking him like surveillance drones. Rebecca Manning's voice rose above the murmur, explaining to the reporter how she'd noticed something off about his uniform, how her military background had taught her to spot inconsistencies. Military background. Her father's background, inherited like a family curse. Marcus reached his truck, a battered Ford F-150 with veteran plates, and fumbled for his keys. His hands, steady through 3 decades of combat operations, trembled slightly as he unlocked the door. The Pentagon was abandoning him. Rebecca Manning was hunting him. And somewhere in Atlanta, high-powered attorneys were filing paperwork that would crack open Pandora's box. His phone rang again before he could start the engine. "Tank?" The voice belonged to Tommy Rodriguez, his assistant director at Warriors Haven. Tommy sounded breathless, panicked. "Man, you need to see the news. Someone's saying..." "I know what they're saying." The phone's been ringing nonstop. Channel 4, Channel 7, some guy from CNN. "They want statements about your service record, about the center's funding sources." "Tank, what the hell is happening?" Through his windshield, Marcus watched Officer Chen approach, her expression apologetic but determined. Behind her, Rebecca Manning spoke animatedly to the news crew, gesturing toward his truck. The camera swiveled to follow her gaze. "Tommy, I need you to do something for me," Marcus said, not taking his eyes off Chen. "Call every resident at the center. Tell them to stay inside today. Don't talk to reporters. Don't answer questions about me or the programs. Can you do that?" "You're scaring me, man." Marcus had seen that fear before, in his daughter's eyes when his deployment stretched longer than promised, in his ex-wife's voice when she'd asked why he couldn't talk about where he'd been for 6 months. The fear of loving someone whose past was classified, whose present could explode without warning. "Just trust me," Marcus said. "And Tommy? Start looking for alternative funding sources." Quietly, he ended the call as Officer Chen tapped on his window. "Colonel Washington, I'm sorry, but we're going to need you to come with us." Marcus nodded and stepped out of the truck, muscle memory keeping his movements crisp and professional. Behind Chen, he noticed her partner's hand had moved closer to his weapon, not threatening, but ready. Word was spreading through their radio chatter. Other officers were arriving, taking positions around the park's perimeter. They weren't treating this as a simple stolen valor complaint anymore. "Am I under arrest?" "We just need to verify some information," Chen said, but her eyes couldn't quite meet his. "Standard procedure for accusations of this nature." Standard procedure. Marcus almost smiled at the phrase. Nothing about this situation was standard. Rebecca Manning had weaponized the system perfectly, using legitimate laws and proper channels to destroy him while maintaining plausible deniability. She looked like the concerned citizen. He looked like the criminal. As Chen escorted him toward the patrol car, Marcus caught fragments of Rebecca's interview. "Responsibility to our real veterans, people who steal honor from those who earned it. My father always said the truth has a way of surfacing." Her father, David Manning, who died believing he was investigating war crimes, never knowing he'd stumbled into something much larger, something that involved weapons shipments and CIA assets, and the kind of gray area operations that kept America's hands clean while other people's blood dried in the sand. Marcus thought about Colonel Hayes' words. "There are things about Sandstorm that even you weren't briefed on." For 17 years, he'd carried the guilt of David Manning's death, believing he'd sacrificed a journalist to protect operational security. But what if there had been another layer? What if Marcus himself had been playing a role in someone else's larger game? The patrol car's door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Through the window, Marcus watched Rebecca Manning finish her interview, her performance flawless. She'd won this round completely, discredited him publicly, triggered official investigations, and forced him into the system where her lawyers could start their real work. But wars weren't won in single engagements, and Rebecca Manning was about to learn that some sleeping giants were better left undisturbed. The car pulled away from Veterans Memorial Park, carrying Marcus toward an uncertain future, while behind them, the news crew began packing their equipment. The story was recorded, the damage was spreading, and somewhere in a Pentagon basement, classified phones were ringing. Holding area smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Marcus sat in the interview room for 3 hours before they released him. No charges filed, but his dress uniform wrinkled now, the crisp military bearing he'd maintained since dawn finally cracking under fluorescent lights and bureaucratic delays. His phone had 17 missed calls. The first voicemail was from his daughter. "Dad, I just saw the news. Call me back, please." The second was from his ex-wife. "Marcus, Keisha's in tears. She's worried this will affect her residency application. Fix this." The third was from a reporter at the Post and Courier. "Colonel Washington, we'd like to get your side of the story." Marcus deleted the rest without listening. Outside the police station, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot where a small crowd of protesters had gathered. Someone held a sign reading "Stolen Valor equal to Stolen Honor." Another read "Investigate, Warriors Haven Funding." Rebecca Manning was nowhere to be seen, but her work continued without her. Marcus drove home to his apartment overlooking the Ashley River, where he'd lived quietly for 3 years, rebuilding something that resembled a normal life. The building's parking garage offered blessed anonymity. No crowds, no cameras, no accusers, just concrete and fluorescent lights, and the echo of his footsteps on the ramp. His apartment door had been tagged with spray paint, "Fake Soldier." Marcus stared at the red letters for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, he'd been expecting escalation, but the realization that Rebecca Manning's campaign had already moved beyond legal channels into street-level harassment. She wasn't just seeking justice anymore. She was orchestrating destruction. Inside, Marcus poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat at his kitchen table with a manila folder he'd hoped never to open again. His personal copies of the Sandstorm files, the ones that hadn't been classified out of existence anyway. Incident reports, personnel records, the after-action summary that had earned him a Silver Star and cost David Manning his life. Journalist embedded with Task Force Alpha compromised operational security by attempting to document classified activities. Asset was detained and materials confiscated per standing orders. Subject released to Iraqi police custody at 1,340 hours. Building struck by insurgent mortars at 0230 hours following day. No survivors. Clean. Clinical. No mention of the fact that David Manning had been investigating weapons shipments that would later disappear from official inventories. No mention of the CIA contractors who'd insisted Manning be handled quietly. No mention of Marcus's objections, overruled by officers whose names had been redacted from every document. Marcus's phone rang. Keisha. Dad. His daughter's voice was steady, controlled, the same tone she'd used as a child when asking why Daddy had to leave again. I need to understand what's happening. It's complicated, sweetheart. The news is saying someone accused you of lying about your military service. That's insane, right? You have medals. I've seen them. Marcus looked at the silver star mounted on his wall, the one awarded for Operation Sandstorm, for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. The citation didn't mention that the enemy fire had come after David Manning's detention, after Marcus had followed orders that still made him sick 17 years later. The medals are real, Marcus said carefully. Then why aren't you angrier? Why aren't you fighting this? Keisha's voice cracked slightly. Dad, they're saying you run some kind of fraudulent veterans organization. My attending physician asked me about it today, asked if my father was really a military officer. The words hit harder than any accusation Rebecca Manning had made. His daughter was paying for his past now, just like she'd paid for his absences during childhood. The cycle continuing, guilt compounding across generations. I'm going to fix this, Marcus said. How? That was the question that had been eating at him since Colonel Hayes' phone call. How do you fight an enemy who's weaponizing the truth? How do you defend yourself when the facts are classified and your own government is prepared to sacrifice you? Marcus heard a car door slam outside his building, followed by footsteps on the exterior stairs. Through his window, he could see Channel 7's news van parked across the street. The reporter from the park stood beside it, checking her notes and gesturing toward his building. They'd found his home address. I have to go, sweetheart. Dad, wait. Marcus ended the call and moved to his bedroom window. 3 more news vans were arriving. A crowd was gathering on the sidewalk, some carrying signs, others just curious onlookers drawn by the cameras. Someone had called in his location to every major outlet in the state. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You should have stayed quiet about my father. Now everyone will learn what kind of soldier you really were. Rebecca Manning had just escalated from public humiliation to psychological warfare. She was forcing him into the open, making privacy impossible, ensuring that every move he made would be recorded and analyzed and weaponized. Marcus closed the blinds and sat back down at his kitchen table. The Sandstorm files lay spread before him like a battlefield map, marked with the positions of the living and the dead. For 17 years, he'd carried David Manning's death as personal guilt. Now he was beginning to understand it might have been something else entirely. Outside, reporters were setting up for the evening news. Inside, Marcus Washington began planning for a war he'd never wanted to fight. But some wars choose their soldiers, whether they're ready or not. The bourbon burned less than the truth. Marcus sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, surrounded by the Sandstorm files he'd memorized over 17 years of sleepless nights. Outside, news crews adjusted their lighting equipment, turning his quiet residential street into a television studio. Inside, his phone continued its relentless buzzing. Reporters, lawyers, veterans from Warriors Haven asking if the accusations were true. But one document kept drawing his attention. A single page buried deep in the operational summary, something he'd glossed over hundreds of times before because it seemed routine. A list of personnel assigned to Task Force Alpha during Operation Sandstorm. Names, ranks, specialties. His finger traced down the roster until he found what had been nagging at his subconscious since Rebecca Manning's first accusation. There, listed as Intelligence Liaison, Captain R&B Morrison, Military Intelligence Corps, R&B Morrison. Rebecca Manning's maiden name was Morrison. He'd seen it on the legal papers her attorney had filed. Marcus pulled out his laptop and began searching military databases he still had access to. Captain Rebecca Beth Morrison, commissioned 1998, served 3 tours in Iraq, specialized in human intelligence and counterintelligence operations. Honorable discharge in 2008 following the death of her father, war correspondent David Manning. She'd been there, 22 years old, a junior intelligence officer assigned to his task force during the operation that killed her father. She hadn't just inherited David Manning's background, she'd been part of the mission that ended his life. Marcus's hands went cold as the implications crystallized. Rebecca hadn't spent years tracking him down for revenge. She'd known exactly where he was for the past 3 years. She'd known about Warriors Haven, about his quiet retirement, about his daughter's medical career. She'd been watching, planning, building her case, while he'd lived in blissful ignorance of who was hunting him. His phone rang. Colonel Hayes again. Tank, we have a problem. Rebecca Manning's attorney just filed a motion to compel testimony from Operation Sandstorm personnel. They're not just going after you, they're subpoenaing the entire task force. She was there, Hayes. Marcus's voice sounded hollow in his own ears. Morrison. Captain Rebecca Morrison was assigned to our unit during Sandstorm. Silence stretched across the connection. When Hayes spoke again, her voice had changed. Jesus Christ, you're sure? I'm looking at the personnel roster right now. Intelligence liaison. She was part of the team that detained her own father. That's not possible. Intelligence would have flagged a family connection. No way they'd assign her to an operation involving her father. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding, like tumblers clicking in a lock he'd never known existed. Unless someone wanted her there. Unless her assignment wasn't coincidence. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that made Marcus's 17 years of guilt feel suddenly naive. David Manning hadn't stumbled into classified operations by accident. His daughter hadn't been randomly assigned to Task Force Alpha, and Marcus himself hadn't been chosen to handle the journalist simply because he was team leader. Hayes, what did you mean earlier? About things I wasn't briefed on? Another pause. Longer this time. When Colonel Hayes spoke, her voice carried the weight of classified secrets finally seeing daylight. David Manning wasn't investigating weapons shipments. Tank. He was investigating his daughter. Someone suspected Rebecca Morrison of selling intelligence to Iraqi insurgents. Her father was getting too close to the truth, so they used us to shut him down. They sent you to confiscate his research, knowing it would implicate his own daughter. The words hit like shrapnel, tearing through 17 years of assumed reality. Marcus had believed he'd sacrificed an innocent journalist to protect American assets. The truth was worse. He'd been manipulated into silencing a father who was about to expose his daughter's treason. The bombing that killed Manning, Marcus said slowly. It wasn't coincidence. No. Rebecca Morrison fed the location to her insurgent contacts 12 hours after you detained her father. She murdered him to protect herself, and she's been planning to frame you for it ever since. Marcus looked out his window at the news crews, understanding now why Rebecca had chosen such a public arena for her accusations. She wasn't seeking justice, she was rewriting history, creating a narrative where Marcus was the villain and she was the grieving daughter seeking truth. If anyone ever discovered her role in her father's death, she'd already established herself as the victim. His phone buzzed with another text. 17 years of planning led to this moment. You destroyed my family. Now I destroy yours. But Rebecca Manning had made one critical error in her perfect revenge plot. She'd assumed Marcus would continue carrying guilt for crimes he'd never committed. She'd counted on his honor to keep him silent about classified operations. She'd forgotten that honor also meant protecting the innocent. Marcus began typing his response. Captain Morrison, your father died trying to save you. Time everyone learned why. Some secrets were worth the cost of exposing them.